Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving deep into some really fascinating stuff this time.
Yeah, this one should be interesting.
So you guys sent in excerpts from Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less. That's by Greg McKeown.
Right.
And so this is sort of your shortcut to becoming really well-informed on the topic of essentialism without having to do all the heavy lifting yourself.
Yeah.
So we're going to go through this and pull out what we think are the real nuggets, the stuff that can really make a difference for you without feeling overwhelmed, right?
Yes.
Like you're trying to drink from a fire hose.
Exactly. I think we all struggle with that.
And the mission today is simple: to understand the core ideas of essentialism and how you can use them to focus on what truly matters in your life, especially when you're feeling pulled in a million different directions. Sound good?
Sounds great.
All right, let's dive in. So, right out of the gate, McKeown kind of lays out the problem that a lot of us face. You know, that feeling of being constantly busy but not really making meaningful progress, like running on a treadmill.
Yeah, he really captures that sense of spreading ourselves too thin, always saying yes, and ending up with, just a millimeter of progress in a million directions.
Exactly. And that's, I think, what resonates so much with a lot of people. They pick up this book and they're like, oh, this is me. This is my life.
Absolutely.
So let's get into some of the solutions, some of the ideas that McKeown presents. And right away, he brings up this principle by Dieter Rams: weniger aber besser.
Right.
Less, but better. So simple, but it seems to really capture the essence of essentialism.
It does. And I think what's important to remember is that it's not just about simplifying for the sake of simplifying.
Right.
It's about intentionally choosing what to focus on and then making those things truly exceptional.
So it's not just like a productivity hack or a way to have a cleaner inbox.
Right.
This is a whole way of thinking about how you live your life, how you approach your work, everything.
Exactly. McKeown is really emphasizing that this is a disciplined pursuit, not just a one-time cleanup. It's an ongoing process of evaluating what's truly essential and ruthlessly eliminating everything else.
So constantly asking yourself, am I investing my time and energy in the right things?
Exactly. He makes a really clear distinction between the trivial many and the vital few, and recognizing that often just a small percentage of our efforts are actually driving the majority of our results. That's where the Pareto principle comes in, the 80-20 rule, which he talks about later in the book.
Right. So figuring out where you can apply that 80-20 rule in your own life.
Absolutely. Where are you putting in a lot of effort for minimal return?
Okay, so let's talk about what happens when we don't embrace this essentialist mindset. McKeown tells this really interesting story about a driven executive who's completely overwhelmed.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. It's a classic case of someone who's successful, but ultimately paying a price for it.
Right, and it almost serves as a cautionary tale, doesn't it?
Absolutely. What's interesting is that McKeown breaks down this sort of descent into diffused efforts into 4 predictable phases.
Okay.
So it often starts with a clear sense of purpose, which leads to some initial success. But then that success actually leads to more and more opportunities and demands. And without that essentialist filter, we end up overcommitted and scattered.
Right, so you're almost penalized for your initial success.
In a way, yes. And eventually it leads to this feeling of being completely overworked and yet not really accomplishing anything truly meaningful.
Right, that classic success paradox. You get good at something, so more opportunities come your way. But if you're not careful, you lose sight of what made you successful in the first place.
Exactly. And he also talks about this non-essentialist storm, right?
Yes.
Being bombarded with too many choices, too much information, too much social pressure to do everything and be everything. It's opinion overload, as he calls it.
Which is so relevant in today's world, right? I mean, we're constantly connected, constantly bombarded with messages and expectations. It's really hard to step back and figure out what truly matters to us, what our own priorities are, separate from all the noise.
Absolutely. It's like this invisible current pushing us in a certain direction, even when it might not be the right direction for us.
Right, and it makes me think of that really powerful quote McKeown includes in the book. It's about the regret of the dying.
Oh, yes. That one really hits home.
I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. It's a pretty stark reminder that this is about more than just productivity, right?
Absolutely. This is about living a life of meaning and authenticity. And that often requires saying no to things, even good things, that don't align with our true priorities.
Right, having the courage to disappoint some people in the short term to avoid a much deeper regret later on.
And McKeown doesn't just talk the talk. He shares a really personal story about making that exact mistake, choosing to go to a client meeting instead of being there for his wife and newborn baby.
Yeah, that one was really powerful. You can just feel the weight of that misplaced priority, the sense that he let something truly essential slip away.
Right, and it highlights those tough trade-offs we all face and how important it is to be intentional about the choices we make.
Okay, so that brings us to the power of choice, which is another core element of essentialism. McKeown quotes Madeline L'Engle here. "It is the ability to choose which makes us human."
And it's not just a philosophical concept, right? It has really practical implications for how we live our lives.
Right. He talks about this realization he had that he had effectively chosen to go to law school simply by not actively choosing to quit.
Oh yeah, that's so insightful.
It made him realize that even inaction, just drifting along, is still a choice. And it can lead us down paths we wouldn't consciously pick for ourselves.
It's a reminder that if we don't actively exercise our power to choose, then someone or something else will choose for us.
Exactly. We become reactive, constantly responding to external demands rather than shaping our own lives and priorities.
And he uses that great analogy of the paper route versus washing cars,
Right.
putting in different amounts of effort for drastically different rewards.
It's a really clear illustration that not all opportunities or efforts are created equal, and essentialism is about being strategic about where we invest our energy.
Exactly. It's about discerning where our efforts will have the greatest impact, which ties back to the Pareto principle, that 80-20 rule we talked about earlier.
Right. And also to Warren Buffett's investment philosophy, right?
Yes, Buffett is known for making a few very carefully chosen big bets on what he believes are essential and saying no to pretty much everything else, even if those other opportunities seem promising on the surface.
So it's about focusing on that vital few. It's interesting, though, because McKeown also emphasizes that essentialists actually take more time to explore their options.
Right.
Which seems a little counterintuitive. Shouldn't they be all about efficiency?
It seems that way. But he argues that this deeper exploration is how they're able to really discern what matters in the long run. It's about making those initial choices really count.
Right, so you need that space to really evaluate and understand before committing.
Exactly. It's a fundamental shift in mindset. The non-essentialist believes that almost everything is essential, and so they end up spread too thin and never really achieving anything significant.
Whereas the essentialist has that ability to ruthlessly distinguish the vital few from the merely good or even the trivial many.
Exactly. They're willing to say no to good things so that they can say yes to the great things.
Okay, so that brings us to the necessity of trade-offs, which is a theme that runs throughout the book. McKeown quotes Michael Porter here. "Strategy is about making choices, trade-offs. It's about deliberately choosing to be different."
Right, and it's not just about business strategy. This applies to all areas of life, how we choose to spend our time and energy.
Absolutely. He uses the example of Southwest Airlines, which has been incredibly successful by sticking to a very focused, essentialist approach. Short-haul flights, no meals, a specific type of aircraft.
Right, and they contrast that with Continental Airlines, which struggled when they tried to be everything to everyone.
Right. They tried to straddle different strategies, and it ended up backfiring.
It's a classic example of you can't be all things to all people and expect to excel. You have to make choices.
It reminds me of that anecdote about the Silicon Valley CEO whose company's value statement included pretty much everything.
Oh yeah, passion, innovation, execution, leadership. Like, what are you not about, right?
Exactly. It becomes meaningless because it doesn't tell you what they're willing to say no to.
Right, there's no sense of priority. And that lack of clear priorities can have really negative consequences.
That's where the example of Johnson & Johnson's response to the Tylenol crisis is so powerful.
Absolutely. They had this really clear credo that prioritized customer safety above all else, and it guided them in making that tough decision to pull Tylenol off the shelves, even though it meant a significant financial loss in the short term.
It's about having your essential values and priorities firmly in place so that when you're faced with a difficult trade-off, the decision is clear.
Exactly. And speaking of tough trade-offs, there's that story about the manager who insisted on having 17 top priority projects.
Right.
It's almost comical, but I'm sure many of us can relate to that feeling of everything being labeled as urgent and important.
Absolutely. By refusing to make those tough trade-offs, you end up diluting your efforts and achieving very little of real impact.
And it's not just a problem in the workplace. McKeown also shares examples from personal life. Like, there are those parents who consciously eliminated certain activities to help their son focus on his path towards Harvard.
Right, and the couple who decided to forego social clubs to prioritize spending quality time with their young children.
It's about making those intentional choices, understanding that saying yes to one thing inevitably means saying no to others.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the core principles of essentialism: less but better, the power of choice, the necessity of trade-offs. Now, the question is, how do we actually put this into practice? How do we live this out in our daily lives?
Right.
And McKeown dives into this in the book, exploring what is essential and emphasizing that it starts with cultivating certain mindsets and practices.
Exactly.
He talks about the need for space to think, time to look and listen, permission to play, the wisdom to sleep, and the discipline of rigorous selection.
And he points out that in our culture, these things are often seen as distractions or luxuries, when in fact, they're essential for us to do our best work and live our best lives.
Absolutely. So let's start with space to think. McKeown makes a really strong case for the importance of creating space for reflection, for getting away from the constant doing and allowing ourselves to just be.
It's about disconnecting from the whirlwind of daily life and giving our minds the space they need to process information, make connections, and come up with new ideas.
He talks about the D School at Stanford, which intentionally designs its physical spaces to encourage new ways of thinking. They have these open, collaborative areas, but they also have quiet spaces for individual reflection.
And they have a class called Designing Life, essentially, which is all about helping students step back and think about their priorities and how they want to live their lives.
It's amazing. They're literally building it into the curriculum. And then there's that anecdote about the executive who started driving to work early just to have that uninterrupted time to sit and think in his car.
Oh yeah, that's a great one.
It might seem counterintuitive, but he found that it was his most productive time. It allowed him to clear his head and focus on the most important things before the day even started.
It's like that famous story about Sir Isaac Newton coming up with the laws of gravity while in isolation during the plague.
Right, exactly. Sometimes we need to step away from the noise and distractions to do our best thinking.
McKeown talks about his own practice of monk mode, which is essentially shutting himself off from the world for a period of time to focus on writing.
Right. Do you have something similar, a way you create that space for yourself?
I do, actually. I find that even short periods of disconnecting, like going for a walk in nature without my phone, can make a huge difference.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's so easy to fill every spare moment with something, you know.
Right.
And we lose those opportunities for our minds to wander and make those unexpected connections.
Exactly. As someone at Twitter said, can you even remember what it was like to be bored? It doesn't happen anymore.
That's so true. Okay, so next, McKeown talks about look, and he uses this interesting analogy of journalism.
Right. It's about learning how to find the essential information hidden within the noise.
He shares this story about Annie Ephron, who always emphasized the importance of figuring out the point of a story and why it mattered.
It's about going beyond just consuming information to actively seeking understanding and meaning.
Exactly. The essentialist learns to filter for what's truly fascinating, what's going to have a real impact.
Like Thomas Friedman, who's known for his deep analysis of global trends.
Right. And he also talks about the importance of paying attention to unusual details.
That's where Miriam Samon's spiderweb analogy comes in.
Right, noticing those things that don't quite fit the pattern because they can often be the most revealing.
And he stresses the importance of clarifying the question we're trying to answer.
Right, because a vague question leads to a messy, non-essential exploration.
Exactly. Have you ever found yourself going down these rabbit holes because you weren't really clear on what you were actually trying to figure out?
Oh, absolutely. It's so easy to get lost in the details if you haven't defined your goal.
Right.
Okay, so next we come to play, which is something that a lot of people, especially in professional settings, tend to dismiss as frivolous.
Oh yeah, play is often seen as something we do when we're kids, but it's actually essential for all of us, regardless of our age or profession.
McKeown draws on Stuart Brown's research here, which shows the vital role of play in brain plasticity, adaptability, and creativity.
Right. And Brown even says, nothing fires up the brain like play.
And it's not just a human thing. McKeown gives the example of grizzly bears, where the level of playfulness as cubs actually correlates with their survival rates as adults.
It's fascinating, right?
Yeah, it suggests that play is essential for navigating a complex world.
And it has all these benefits. McKeown talks about how it's an antidote to stress, it helps us develop our executive functions, and it even fosters creativity.
He lists examples like Columbus, Newton, Watson, and Crick, even Einstein, all having major breakthroughs during moments of what might have looked like play.
It really challenges our definition of what it means to be productive.
It does, and what's encouraging is that more and more companies are starting to recognize the importance of play and incorporate it into their culture.
Like Twitter, which uses improv games in their meetings, and IDEO, which has a microbus filled with toys and games.
And Google, with their famous nap pods and slides.
It's not just about having fun. It's about fostering a more creative and collaborative work environment.
Right. And McKeown even suggests that we should consciously try to reintroduce more playfulness into our lives.
What kind of play did you enjoy as a child?
Oh, I was a big Lego builder. I could spend hours just building and creating.
Maybe there's a way to bring some of that back into your life now.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, next up is sleep, which in our culture is often seen as something we have to sacrifice to get more done.
Right. We wear it as a badge of honor, like, oh, I only slept 4 hours last night. But the research is clear that this is incredibly counterproductive.
Absolutely. McKeown talks about a guy named Jeff who experienced severe burnout from consistently neglecting his sleep.
It's a reminder that sleep is not a luxury. It's essential for our physical and mental well-being.
Right. And he shares that even Bill Clinton admitted that sleep deprivation led to some bad decisions during his presidency.
It's so important to recognize that we're not actually more productive when we're sleep deprived.
And the research backs this up. There was a study at Lubbock University that showed that sleep actually enhances our problem-solving abilities.
Our brains are actually working while we sleep, encoding and restructuring information, and even short naps have been shown to boost creativity.
So prioritizing sleep isn't being lazy. It's about setting ourselves up to perform at our best.
Exactly. And it's encouraging to see leaders like Jeff Bezos and Mark Andreessen talking about how much they prioritize sleep.
It's a sign that maybe the culture is starting to shift.
Hopefully.
Okay, so the last element in this section is select, and this is all about applying incredibly rigorous criteria to the choices we make.
It's about being highly selective about what we commit to.
He tells a story about a struggling software company that turned things around by implementing very strict criteria for which projects they would take on.
And Vitso, the furniture company, has a really rigorous hiring process where they focus on whether a candidate will be an absolutely natural fit.
And Aaron Levy, the CEO of Vox, asks himself, could this person have been one of the founding members of the team?
It's about setting the bar really high.
Exactly. It's not just about identifying what is essential, it's about actively eliminating everything that isn't.
And he offers this great killer question to help us evaluate both our possessions and the opportunities that come our way.
If I didn't already own this, how much would I spend to buy it? Or, for an opportunity, if I didn't already have this on my plate, what would I be willing to do to acquire it?
It forces you to cut through any sentimental attachment or perceived obligation and really assess the true value.
Okay, so we've talked about how to identify and explore what is essential, but now we need to figure out how to actually eliminate the non-essential from our lives.
Right, because that's where we free up the time and energy to focus on what truly matters.
And McKeown emphasizes that having a clear sense of purpose is absolutely critical for being able to effectively eliminate.
He goes into detail about the negative consequences of a lack of purpose, both for individuals and organizations.
Right, he talks about decreased motivation, increased infighting, and people pursuing their own misaligned interests.
It's all about having that clear, inspiring statement of purpose that everyone can rally around.
He poses these two essential questions. If we could be truly excellent at only one thing, what would it be? And how will we know when we're done?
It's about getting really specific about what success looks like.
And then, of course, there's the element of courage. McKeown uses the powerful example of Rosa Parks and her refusal to give up her seat on the bus.
Right. It was an act of courage that sparked a movement.
And it's a reminder that sometimes saying no is the most courageous thing we can do.
It allows us to stand up for what we believe in and protect what's truly essential.
And McKeown contrasts the non-essentialist's fear of saying no with the essentialist's understanding that saying no to the non-essential is what allows them to say yes to the things that really matter.
And he offers some really practical advice on how to say no gracefully.
Like separating the decision from the relationship, being clear and direct, and even offering alternative solutions.
He even gives some specific scripts we can use, like I'm completely booked or it's not a priority right now.
Which is so helpful because often it's the not knowing how to say no that holds us back.
Right.
And then there's the trap of the sunk cost bias, which is that tendency to keep investing in something just because we've already put so much into it, even when it's no longer serving us.
Well, yeah, like sitting through a terrible movie just because you already bought the ticket.
Exactly. Or staying in a job that makes you miserable just because you've been there for so long.
It takes courage to recognize when we need to cut our losses and move on.
And McKeown also introduces the endowment effect, which is that bias we have to overvalue things we already possess.
He suggests trying to pretend you don't own it yet, to help you make a more objective decision about whether to keep it.
That's a really interesting tip. Okay, so we've talked about how to identify and eliminate the non-essential, but now we need to figure out how to actually make the essential effortless.
Right, which is where the execute phase comes in.
McKeown starts by highlighting the power of editing, ruthlessly removing anything that's distracting, unnecessary, or doesn't fit.
He talks about condensing, learning to say more with less.
Like Graham Hill's life-edited apartment, where everything serves multiple purposes.
And the executive who condensed a 2-hour meeting into 10 minutes.
It's about being really intentional about what you include and what you leave out.
And then there's the importance of correcting, making sure that our purpose and intent are clear and that we're constantly course-correcting as needed.
And then there's the freedom that comes from setting clear boundaries.
McKeown really reframes the idea of boundaries. He argues that they're not restrictive, they're actually liberating.
Because they protect our time and energy and prevent us from having to constantly say no.
Right.
He offers that great reminder. Their problem is not your problem.
It's about being helpful, but not taking on other people's burdens to the detriment of our own essential priorities.
And he encourages us to identify our deal breakers and articulate our boundaries clearly and proactively.
And to create social contracts, explicitly outlining expectations and boundaries up front.
And then there's the smart concept of creating buffers to reduce friction.
Like his car game analogy, adding extra time to their travel estimates to avoid last-minute stress.
It's about being prepared for the unexpected and not assuming a best-case scenario.
And he contrasts that with the essentialist practice of extreme and early preparation.
He uses the example of Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott, who both raced to the South Pole, but with very different approaches to preparation.
Amundsen was meticulous and planned for every contingency, while Scott was much more reactive.
And we know how that turned out.
Right. So McKeown recommends adding a 50% buffer to our time estimates and engaging in scenario planning to anticipate potential risks.
Then there's this seemingly counterintuitive idea of subtracting by removing obstacles.
It's about identifying those key constraints that are holding us back and figuring out how to eliminate them.
He uses the analogy of the slowest hiker in a group and how focusing on that one person can dramatically improve the overall speed of the group.
And he shares that personal story about how his wife's lack of planning time was the main obstacle to their family's smooth functioning.
It's a reminder that sometimes the biggest impact comes from addressing that one key bottleneck.
And that brings us to the power of small wins.
He tells the story of Richmond, Canada, and their positive tickets policing strategy, where officers would reward people for positive behaviors.
It led to a significant reduction in recidivism, showing that even small positive actions can have a ripple effect.
It's a great example of how we don't always need to make huge changes to see significant results.
And he also talks about the importance of creating systems to support our essential behaviors.
Like the token system he and his wife created to reduce screen time and encourage reading in their family.
It's about making it easier to do the things we want to do and harder to do the things we don't want to do.
And then there's the power of routines.
He gives the example of Michael Phelps and his incredibly detailed pre-race routine,
which helped him to focus and perform at his best.
And he points out that even something as simple as a regular weekly meeting can actually free up mental energy by eliminating the need for constant individual planning.
And he shares that almost 40% of our daily choices are actually unconscious habits.
So if we can develop essential routines, they can become powerful drivers of consistent progress.
And then finally, we come to the importance of focus.
McKeown poses that simple but powerful question: what's important now?
And he tells the story of Larry Gelwicks, a legendary rugby coach, who used this question to help his team stay focused on their own game.
It's about being present in the moment and not getting distracted by the past or the future.
McKeown shares his own evening routine for clearing his mind and focusing on what's essential before sleep.
He recommends getting those someday ideas out of your head by writing them down and then focusing on your what's essential now list.
He also talks about the pause that refreshes, a technique for consciously transitioning between tasks.
And he touches on the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, who emphasizes the importance of mindfulness and being present in each moment.
It's about really savoring those kairos moments, those experiences of profound connection and timelessness.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
And in the conclusion of the book, McKeown offers some really insightful reflections on the power of essentialism.
Right, he talks about how the benefits are cumulative, they build on each other over time.
And he revisits that paradox of success, showing how essentialism can help us break free from that cycle of overcommitment and overwhelm.
He shares some personal examples of what being an essentialist means to him, like prioritizing family and having the courage to say no to demanding work commitments.
And he emphasizes that ultimately, focusing on the essentials is a choice. But in making that choice, we gain a sense of liberation and control over our lives.
He tells the story of his Stanford or bust decision, a moment where he really committed to his essential path.
And he quotes the Dalai Lama, "If one's life is simple, contentment has to come. Simplicity is extremely important for happiness."
McKeown concludes by framing the life of an essentialist not as one of deprivation, but as a life of meaning, a life that truly matters because it's focused on what's most important.
He shares that story about the father who realized he was so focused on recording the scenery that he missed experiencing the moment with his daughter.
It's a powerful reminder to be present and appreciate what's right in front of us.
And McKeown reflects on his own learnings from writing the book, emphasizing the preciousness of time and the importance of family.
And he even applies the principles of essentialism to building effective teams.
Highlighting the need for a clear, essential intent and how essentialist leaders make it easy for people to follow through on priorities.
And he ends with a quote from Elabot: "Simplicity is the key to brilliance."
It's a great way to sum up the core message of the book. Focus on the vital few and make them truly exceptional.
So for you, our listener, as you reflect on this deep dive into essentialism, I want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
What is one non-essential commitment, task, or even thought pattern that you can consciously eliminate this week to create more space and energy for what truly matters to you?
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
We'll see you next time.